and I will be your host for today's webinar. Before we get started, please keep in mind that there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, but I encourage you to enter your questions in the comments panel throughout the presentation. Our presenter today is Benjamin Mossé, Chief Executive Officer of Mossé Security. Benjamin founded the Mossé Cybersecurity Institute to offer world-class information security learning programs in APAC and beyond. Since its creation, a wide range of students from government officials, law enforcement officers, business executives, board members and IT security professionals have attended Mossé Cybersecurity Institute's programs and presentations. So without further ado, I will hand the presentation over to you, Benjamin.
Thank you, Manuela.
Okay, I've just passed you the ball, so if you can just share the presentation and full screen it for us.
Sure. Let me know if you can see it full screen now.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My webinar today is on the top 15 cybersecurity leadership questions that business leaders should ask or would do well to ask to drive cybersecurity in their organizations. So a little bit about myself before we get started. My name is Benjamin Mossé. I am the CEO of Mossé Security and the founder of Mossé Cybersecurity Institute. And our specialty as a company and as an institute is to find, track, disrupt, help, prosecute, and simulate cyber attackers. And the purpose of my presentation today is to impart you with practical concepts and tools to become a cybersecurity champion in your organization. You may never have considered yourself a cybersecurity champion, but I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll understand how you could become one for your company. So before we get into the actual 15 questions, I'll begin the presentation with a short introduction to cybersecurity. I will be outlining the two main challenges that we see businesses face today, and then the 15 questions will help you address those challenges as well as design a very comprehensive plan for your company. So, in today's world, all the different types of threat actors, whether those be organized criminals, terrorist organizations like ISIS, activists, or even just disgruntled employees, use computers and the internet as an avenue for attack. And I'm sure many of you would have read over the last few months just how many security breaches are happening all over the world. So much so that in 2013, Europol announced that cybercrime was now more profitable for criminals than the drug trade. And the overall consensus all over the world is that for the most part, organizations are ill-prepared, not unprepared, but ill-prepared to prevent and detect and respond to cyber attacks. Some of the key indicators that show that organizations are ill-prepared are that, according to industry statistics, at least 80% of all organizations have threats on their networks right now that they do not know about. So the threats can sometimes be very minor, but also in some cases they can also be very serious. That the average number of days for organizations to detect that they have been compromised, that they have threat actors on their network, is about 227 days at the moment. And even when the threats get detected, on average, it takes organizations between 20 to 30 days to remove the attackers from the network. Now, if you add all of these things, that explains how come, in most cases, when a company has a breach, it finds out way too late that it's been breached. By then, the attackers have achieved their mission. They've stolen the data that they wanted to steal. They've sabotaged the systems that they wanted to sabotage. And it's been way too late for the company to be able to do anything about it. And to add to all of those complexities, 80% of people in companies think that cybersecurity is just an IT issue. It's something for a geek person sitting at a cubicle in the IT department to solve for them. But it's not their role to do anything about protecting themselves. And so as a result of this culture, it just adds to the complexity of IT departments and cybersecurity departments to be able to actually defend the companies that they work for. And so when we run surveys, specifically in Australia, we find that between 40 to 50% of organizations are not confident at all in their ability to detect a breach. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, I'll have given you more than just pointers about what to do, but an actual systematic methodology that as a business executive you can apply to beat the odds, so to speak. So just to show you how real this problem is, and I'm sure you've already read a lot online, but it's always good to have a few case studies in any presentations. This image here that you see on my screen is an underground website that is hosted in a part of the internet that is hidden. And that hidden part of the internet is used by organized criminal organizations to sell the data they have stolen from companies, maybe like your company. And on this website, what we see is that criminals can buy and sell the personal identities of regular citizens to be able to commit tax fraud. In this case, you could go on this website if you knew how to access it, and you would have hundreds of people. In fact, if we look at this page, this was the last page of 787 pages of people that have their information online, such as their names, their last names, their address, their date of birth, photocopies of their passports or driver's license, and they're being put online to be sold to the highest bidder for those people to commit tax fraud under other people's names. Another example that shows you just how organized the attackers are is this image here. Here we see a hacker that has compromised hundreds of computers belonging to many different organizations all over the world. So if you look at the countries here, you see many different countries. And what the hackers do now is that he or she or the group sells the compromised computers to other hackers to go steal data on the network where those computers are located. And so it will become very apparent to you over the next few slides just how organized the cybercrime industry is. We have hackers that build weapons, we have hackers that compromise machines, and then they sell the access to those machines to other hackers who go on the network and steal the data from all the different databases. And then we have people who go online and sell the data. So let's say that if someone wanted to hack, let's say, a big bank, they may not need to hack it. They may just find that the hacker already has hacked it, and they just buy the access from them. Another example here, and this, interestingly enough, is actually a public company based in the US that buys vulnerabilities in the top softwares that almost all the companies in the world use. And there are plenty of companies like this that also operate secretly. So we don't actually know how much they charge for vulnerabilities, but just to show you an example about what we do know is here, if you were a hacker and you had found a way to hack an iPhone, okay, the vulnerability that someone like a public company in the US is ready to pay for is $1.5 million at the moment, okay? If you're running Google Chrome or IE or Edge, okay, a vulnerability in those pieces of software goes for about $30,000 right now, okay? And if you knew a lot about computers and you looked at this list, you'd probably realize that your company today on your network, you would have all of those softwares on it, or most of those softwares on it. And so right now, there's a complete industry where hackers are finding vulnerabilities and then they're selling it to other hackers, and those hackers come and hack you, is what is happening. And the prices for some of those vulnerabilities are extremely high, enough for really good criminals to make a great living out of this. And if you're wondering how much money they make, well, let me give you a bit of a picture on that. A credit card number on the black market today sells between about $1 to $200 per card, depending on how much cash there is on the card and where the card can be used in the world. If you wanted to buy a full identity to commit ID theft on the underground market, you could buy this for about $15 today. And you may be wondering, how come it's so cheap? The answer is quite simply that there is so much of it out there. So many personal records have been stolen, so many credit card numbers have been stolen that the price for them is very low. And on the underground market, everything has a price. Absolutely everything has a price. Even hacking someone's Twitter account has a price. If you're using Facebook, your Facebook account has a price on the underground market for cyber criminals. Because what do? They'll hack into your Twitter or your Facebook, and then they'll be able to send spam to your friends and family members to try and compromise their computer. And because the spam is coming from your account, well, people are more likely to fall into the trap of clicking on the link, of viewing something that they're not supposed to view on the internet. And so as a result of this, even social media accounts have a price. Taking a computer ransom, we've all heard of ransomware, and maybe we'll get to chat more about this later in this presentation. Today it's about between $50 to $100 per computer or per person to unlock it. And I think that statistically about 30% of companies in Australia have now been hit by ransomware. And when it's a single computer and you have backups, you can usually recover. But we've had clients here in Melbourne that have been hit where over 2,000 computers in less than 24 hours were all locked by ransomware. So those were really, critical scenarios for clients. And so overall, we think that today the cybercrime industry is at least a $1.3 trillion per year industry. So it's very big, very, very big. So if you're wondering who the attackers are, well, we generally split them into 6 groups. Number 1, we have the activists. I would imagine that most of you would have heard about the anonymous group. Now, the activists are typically motivated, they are politically motivated. So anonymous, for example, will look at the current political climate, they'll find a cause, and then they'll find thousands of people to rally to their cause and try to hack computers for them. So organizations like Scientology or certain political organizations are often targeted by anonymous. Then we have the professional hackers. These are the people that either operate alone or in small groups. And so this person that I have here on the slide with was a professional hacker in the US that eventually ended up getting arrested, but his specialty was to find vulnerabilities in publicly listed companies that would affect their reputation. He would publish the information online to get the share price of those companies to drop, and he would bet against them in the marketplace and make money. He ended up getting arrested for it. He came out of prison, and now he is living in Lebanon, where he can no longer be arrested, and I believe that he may still be operating and still hacking. Then we have the script kiddies. Okay, this is a pretty funny image of a child that's been arrested. Those are often just the teenagers that are still in high school or in university that hack for fun. Often they go online, they download automated hacking tools, and a lot of the time they're harmless. They're not necessarily very good hackers for the most part. But every now and then, they can still cause a lot of damage. And there have been cases where teenagers have definitely caused damage to private companies as well. Then we have organized criminals. These are the businessmen and businesswomen of the cybercrime industry. These are the people that make a living out of computer hacking, and that's their job. They wake up in the morning, they pick the targets, they hack them, and they have plans that go from, building weapons and attacking companies all the way to selling money, selling the data on underground markets. Then we have the insiders. Now, in some cases, those are legitimate whistleblowers. And I guess we can all have our own opinion about Edward Snowden. But what I have seen, though, in Australia is that, for the most part, when I got to catch insiders and interview them alongside with law enforcement, I came to realize that often those were employees that had simply forgotten that the mission of the company they worked for, and they totally lost track about their fellow employees. And so in some cases, they sabotaged IT systems that prevented fellow employees and co-workers from working and servicing their clients, and they thought that they were doing this for a good cause, but in many cases, I think that they were blinded by anger. It's what I have personally noticed. And finally, we have the nation states. This is country-to-country warfare, and it's very real for Australia. A year ago or 18 months ago, the Prime Minister Cabinet announced that the Bureau of Meteorology here in Melbourne got hacked by China. Now you may be wondering, why would China want to hack the weather reports? Well, weather data is being used for mission-critical services in this country. A plane cannot land or cannot take off without BOM giving the go-ahead with their weather data. The military cannot launch a military operation if it does not have the go-ahead from the data of BOM, okay? So who controls the weather has control over other critical agencies and functions all over this country. And today we know that there are growing tensions between the United States and China, and it's very possible that Australia, if it gets involved in any, at least they don't really believe that Australia would be invaded, or at least not at the beginning, but a cyber attack is very, very likely to occur. And so for us, what does that mean? Well, it would mean that we could find ourselves in the crossfire of military operations, okay? If a country was to attack Australia, they could go for the power grid, they could go for the superannuation industry, they could go for our financial services and our banks, and so this is very real. And I believe that the Australian government takes this threat very seriously. Now, let's talk a bit more about the organized criminals. These guys are organized like real businesses. And I guess I've used some funny images to lighten up a bit the slide, but at the core of it, they have leaders that act as CEO, CFO, CIO of the company. They select targets, they rent offices, they hire engineers, they hire office spaces, and so on and so forth. And what they do a lot of the times is that they end up hiring software engineers that build malware. So just like most of you may have hired people to build websites for you and mobile apps, these guys hire IT engineers to build cyber weapons to hack into computers, okay? Then those cyber weapons are given to what we call stealers. They use those cyber weapons to hack into companies, to access data on the networks of their targets and to steal it. And once they've stolen it, they literally have salespeople that go online. And some of those organizations even have professional negotiators that they've hired to be able to sell data and negotiate the sale of their data at the highest price. And once they've done that, they have people that then help them launder the money. And so let me give you an example of this. Last year, I believe that it was in Asia that the SWIFT international banking system was attacked. The hackers, within a matter of a few minutes, stole over $80 million US. All of the money was wired in a town on the border of Russia, North Korea, and China. And in that town, there is a casino, and this is where they send the money, and they use the casino to launder the money. And so this was a very coordinated attack, where the attackers did a lot of research. They found out how to hack into the SWIFT banking system. They figured out how the SWIFT banking system works to be able to send an unauthorized transaction to this casino for a value of $80 million. And then they were organized in such a way that they could never get arrested, and they could launder the money in a way so that they can then spend it, either in China, in Russia, or in other places all over the world. In Australia, the largest breach that is publicly known, and I'll say that again, that is publicly known, because there have been, I believe, much larger private breaches, is the Red Cross breach that happened last year. And interestingly enough, this one was not about hackers hacking the Red Cross. This was an IT engineer that went and did an upgrade of a database system, and he stored the backup file on the internet. And so for a period of a few days or a few months, okay, the personal data of $500,000 were exposed, actually for about 6 years. Now that file was detected, it was reported to the Red Cross, and obviously it was removed from the internet. Now, up until very recently, no company in Australia had to report that when it gets breached. That has now changed. In the last few weeks, data breach notification has now passed as a legislation, and certain companies will have to report if they get breached or not, and what happened. And so I would expect that we will get a lot more data about breaches that happened in Australia over the next coming years. Now, what are the consequences of all those breaches? Well, at a very high level, for businesses and employees, breaches lead to things like extortion, blackmail, companies being taken hostage, vandalism, whereby the hackers go and destroy computer networks, as well as things like damage to reputation, financial losses, and even in some cases, employees and executives getting fired. So that's the side of the breach that relates to businesses and employees. But the part that we must also cover is the consequences to the private individuals, to the people whom their data gets stolen. For them, the consequences can be things like harassment, ruined reputation. So for example, if you were a person who had your data in the Red Cross backup file that was stolen, and you had some sort of blood disease, or you had a sexually transmitted disease, this would have been marked in that file. And so people could have found out just by reading this backup file. They can also lead to things like wrongful arrest. And I'll have a very interesting test case for you in a second. Home invasion, obscene phone calls, fraud, kidnapping. Kidnapping often happens for people that are VIPs, that travel overseas, and their devices have been compromised, and the attackers will hack into the GPS system and kidnap them and then ask for a ransom to the family. Invasion of privacy, impersonation. So these are all the consequences to private individuals. Now, we've spoken about breaches that may lead to millions of records being stolen, or at least in the case of Red Cross, 500,000. But what does that really mean for a person who would have their credit card stolen, for example, or their identity stolen? Well, let's look at a case study that happened in Australia in 2004. Two men, Mr. Webster and Mr. Thompson, went into Coles one day to buy their groceries. And when they went to pay with their credit card, the Coles payment system flagged their credit card as being a fraudulent credit card. And so what happened? Well, the security guard came along and arrested them. Well, he stopped them. The police arrived, and the police arrested them in front of everyone in the mall. As a result of being arrested in front of everyone at peak hour at courts, I would like to read the testimony of Mr. Thompson. I'm going to read as if I was him. I felt violated and bullied and not trusted and accused. I felt completely unsure and embarrassed. And as a result of this episode, Mr. Thompson started to wet himself while being escorted by the police from a grocery store within the mall as the shoppers at the checkout counter stared. The court heard Mr. Webster that he had been undergoing psychiatric treatment after having been wrongfully arrested and imprisoned for credit card fraud, when really he had been the victim. And that's something that is worthwhile pointing. Cybercrime is one of the only crimes out there where the victim is being blamed for the crime. And often when we talk about cybersecurity in business, we talk about things like, damage to reputation and financial losses. But more often than not, what I have come to realize is that in many cases, it's the people behind the statistics, it's the people inside the records that were stolen that pay the real psychological, emotional price for the breach. Here's another case that happened in Melbourne. One day, one of our clients called us in an emergency, and he said that his business plans and all of his confidential files on his computer had been deleted. So we went on site, and on his desk, we picked up his workstation and we opened it up, and we discovered a hard drive that was not connected to the motherboard. When we pulled out the hard drive, it had weird sounds in it. So we opened it with a screwdriver, and we discovered that the inside of the box here was full of sand. And in it, it had a listening wire with a battery. And whoever had been targeting our clients had been spying on him for months. In the end, we discovered spy devices all over his house, including in the toilets. Our client, who was the founder of a startup in the music industry, got so freaked out that that day he packed his bags and he disappeared for 6 months. That was how scared he got after this episode. And the people who obviously didn't want him to succeed did everything they could to scare him enough into abandoning his business. Because that's what he did in the end. He just walked away from it all. So now that I've scared all of you, let's talk a bit about the cybersecurity challenges that I see organizations have, and how can we address those challenges. Some of you may have security professionals working for you, and or if you don't, regardless, what I tend to find everywhere, all over the country, is that companies make two big mistakes that as a result of those mistakes, their security defenses cannot protect them. The very first mistake that they make is that they invest too much in technology and not enough in people. They buy firewalls, new antiviruses, they do upgrades to systems, but they never train their people on how to have a culture of security in the company. The second mistake that I see them make a lot is that they do not capture any data to prove that their defenses are working. I'll say that again. Most companies invest millions of dollars in cybersecurity, but do not collect any data to prove that what they are doing is working. And as a result to this, we arrive to all of the statistics that I spoke about at the beginning of the presentation. So what are two solutions to those problems? Number one, the very first realization that I would like to impart is that cybersecurity starts with every person in your company. And so we recommend that you adopt a culture of learning with us. In this manner, everyone in your company is trained on how they may be attacked. They've learned the best ways in which they can defend themselves. They've learned how to detect attacks and how to work as a team when a breach happens. Only when everyone from the CEO through the secretary in the company is well trained and that they have become involved in protecting your company, that we can begin to solve the cyber security challenge. The second realization I would like to impart is that we cannot improve what we are not measuring. And so no matter how much you may already have invested in cybersecurity, if you cannot prove with data that you're stopping the hackers, then I'm sorry, but I'm going to be crude, you're probably not. And so top organizations all over the world today are embracing this concept of data-driven security, where every round of security investment has to demonstrate that it has improved defenses using data. And what we find as well with companies that use data-driven security is that they focus on small, incremental, and rapid improvements to their defenses, as opposed to putting together very large projects of work that go over multiple years and that more often than not never achieve the outcomes that the company wanted. So these two solutions bring me to the top 15 questions that business executives and senior management should ask to begin creating a culture of learning and use data-driven security. Just before we get into the 15 questions, let me mention that whenever we talk about cybersecurity, we are really referring to the science of managing cyber risks. And at a high level, cyber risk is defined with the formula vulnerability times threat times estimated loss, and that makes your cyber risk. That means that your cyber risk is your most critical vulnerabilities, exploited by your greatest adversaries in the worst case scenario possible. This diagram also shows you the 3 areas where you have an opportunity to reduce your cyber risk in such a way as to minimize the consequences of a breach. Namely, we can manage our vulnerabilities, we can disrupt our adversaries, and we can structure our IT assets in such a way that we minimize the consequences of those assets being breached. And that's exactly what the 15 questions aim to do. So let's begin. The very first goal that every company should work towards is reducing the number of critical and high-risk vulnerabilities it has. As an executive, the 3 most powerful questions you could ask to achieve this are: how many critical and high-risk vulnerabilities do we have today? How many of those vulnerabilities can we mitigate in the next 90 days? And what resources are required to fix those vulnerabilities? If you took those 3 questions and asked those to your IT departments, and you did this every quarter, you would find that if you actually allocate funding to fixing your vulnerabilities, the avenue for hackers to hack into your network would decrease over time. Secondly, organizations must ensure that they are fast at detecting and recovering from breaches. In some cases, if they're facing more complex and sophisticated adversaries, they may also have to develop bespoke security solutions to stop the attackers that try to breach their network again and again. 4 very powerful questions that an executive can ask are: how many threat actors breached our network in the last 90 days? For each intrusion, what risk were we exposed to? How much time did it take us to detect the intrusions and recover? And finally, what resources are required to prevent the attackers from coming back? Because usually, if the attackers have discovered that you are a juicy target, they'll come back for more. And so your aim should be to detect and stop the attackers before they cause any damage, as well as invest to make sure that they cannot come back. So some really good metrics for this are to look at the number of intrusions, look at the skill level that it took them to breach into the network, how many days it took us to detect them, and aim to reduce all those metrics. Now, thirdly, one of the best ways to reduce your cyber risk is simply not to hold any data that could attract criminals. So we recommend that you try as much as possible to limit your exposure by deleting data that no longer holds business value. And if you're not sure whether the data can be deleted, then you should definitely encrypt it. So here are 3 very powerful questions that you can ask. How much data do we have at risk today? How much of that data can we safely remove in the next 90 days because it does not hold any business value to us anymore? How much data can we safely encrypt and archive in the next 90 days? So if we can't delete it, let's encrypt it and store it somewhere safe. With those questions, you would see your risk exposure decrease over time, which in turn would significantly reduce the impact of any breach. Now, if you took the questions I've shared with you so far and you posed them to your IT team every quarter, they should deliver you with a report that gives you an idea of what your risk is today, what they plan to propose to reduce that risk. Now, in some cases, it's worthwhile testing whether the plan they are proposing is actually of good quality. And so here we add 5 more questions to make sure that the plan is rock solid. Number 1, how are we leveraging our existing investments to solve today's challenges? One of the very last things you'd want to do is spend too much money buying more technology if you already had bought something that could help you solve today's problems. Secondly, how are we going to measure the effectiveness of this round of investments? So once again, we go back to this idea that we must do data-driven security. Then we make sure that the plan is fairly long-term. So we ask, how are we making sure this round of investments will continue to yield results in 12 months? Then we can ask to make sure that we can actually achieve the plan. How do we know for sure if we have the right people with the right knowledge to implement the plan in the first place? And finally, it's always good to have a backup plan. So it's always good to ask, how will we address things if we find that we're off track? If the investment is not working out, what's plan B? What's plan C? So we've actually shared this systematic method of using the 15 leadership questions to many of our clients now. And actually, to be frank, we've been astounded by the results that some of our clients have been able to achieve with this very simple tool that they've been using every month or every quarter. We've had multiple clients that have trained every person in their company in cybersecurity and have achieved what we call the culture of learning. Then we've also had clients that have reviewed all of their network end-to-end for active and dormant threat actors and discovered that they had compromises that they did not know about and were able to stop them before those breaches caused financial or reputational damages. We've had one client that has managed to remove 70% of their data. That's an amazing number. Most clients did not arrive to 70%, but one did. We've also had clients that, using this method, have consistently been able to stop and detect the top 200 attack tactics and techniques employed by attackers. And when you can do this, you're very confident that only a fairly sophisticated attacker could hack you. If you can stop the top 200 tactics, you're in a very good position at that point. And we've also had many clients that have managed to patch 80% of all of their critical and high-risk missing security patches. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to leave you with this slide for a second and to inspire you to take those metrics as your own goals. I know that those may be very big goals at this stage, but it gives you an idea of what is possible to do with this very simple tool when it's applied systematically and very thoroughly. So, to conclude today's presentation, I'd like to once again invite you to become a cybersecurity champion in your company by using the 15 leadership questions that we talked about today. I'd like as well to advise again to take things in small incremental steps. And at each step, implement a feedback loop using data to monitor your progress. And finally, a good investment ratio that we have found for most clients is to invest 40% of their resources in people, 30% in processes, and only 20% in technology. And you'll find that most companies today do the reverse. We don't advise doing the reverse for a very simple reason. Today, if your company is running Microsoft Windows 10, you have all the tools on your computer to protect yourself, or almost all the tools. Okay? So in many cases, clients discovered that they already had all the technology that they needed to be able to protect their networks, and that significant investments in additional technologies were not that important. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time today once again, and I will now open the webinar to questions.
Thank you, Benjamin, for this fantastic session. We will now go through the audience questions. Please type your questions into the chat panel and we'll address them accordingly. We've already got a question from James. If you had to pick one metric to report to executives, etc., what would it be?
It would be the first 10 questions of the, so I don't have a single one. I think that a single one is probably not enough. I would say that showing that there's been a reduction in vulnerabilities, showing that there's been improvements in the speed of detecting and recovering from breaches, and then showing that there's been a reduction in the risk profile of the organization by deleting the data or removing assets that are no longer being used, so that if those get hacked, it just doesn't matter anymore. So if you go with that, you can't go wrong, really.
Perfect, thank you. And we've got a question from Dario. What is the best way to get people to take cybersecurity seriously?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I've taught something like 5,000 employees now in terms of imparting them the culture of learning that we offer. And what I have found is that the most powerful motivator for people is to realize just how much they can use their knowledge of cybersecurity to protect their family members, protect their friends, and then protect their company and their fellow co-workers. So I found that it's more effective to come from a place of empowering them to want to become cybersecurity champion, because by learning how to better protect themselves, they can also protect the people that matter to them, as opposed to coming from a place of fear. Unfortunately, this is very much an industry where we have a lot of bad news to share with people, but I think that if at some point it can be reframed into giving them a very powerful and positive tool that will empower them, I think that's the way to go.
Okay, thank you. And we've got another one from Steve. What would you suggest covering in corporate user training?
Well, I think that in my experience, imparting tools to employees, like imparting them how to use a password manager, imparting them how to generate strong passwords and share passwords securely, all of this is very good, and it's fairly easy for them to learn how to do this. The part that we find more challenging is what we call behavior change. And that's the part that I think is missing a lot in a lot of the corporate trainings that we've seen, where maybe an employee just logs into a computer and they have to do, like a questionnaire online, and it's like yes, no questions, and there's a few trap questions, and they can start again until they get it right. That's not very effective. So my recommendation would be to look at behavior change methodologies and then designing workshops and exercises that will help employees reframe how they view themselves, how they view their role as a cybersecurity champion. And once they see themselves, or they can see themselves as a cybersecurity champion, then you'll find that all the usual tools, like patching their machine, not opening emails that come from people they did not expect, all of this becomes very straightforward, and they actually really enjoy learning all those defense tactics.
Okay, fantastic. And then we've got a question from Danny. Deleting data seems to me to be very difficult. Do you have any strategies?
Yes, absolutely. When we actually recommend that, most companies think that it's going to be impossible or it's going to be too hard. What we find is that once we start going into the details of it, most pieces of data has a life cycle to it. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you are a finance company where you may give, a credit card to someone who submit their details online. Okay, you'll find that some people will start the application process and they'll stop halfway through. So what you can do, for example, is say, well, anyone that's not come back to their application within 10 days of having starting it, we can actually delete that data of whatever they've entered so far, so that we don't hold the risk of it anymore. Then we can say, okay, well, now they've gone through the entire process and we've approved them. Then let's actually decide at that point, what data do we need for business to continue on, or is there pieces, or are there pieces of data that we could store elsewhere in an encrypted format and archive that data? So at this point, we start to split what is necessary on a daily basis and what's not. And then we can take this a step forward. If we continue the life cycle of the data, we can say, well, the credit card number has been expired. So maybe at this point, we can archive all of their data, or we can delete all of their data past a certain point. So my recommendation would be to literally launch a project to look at every data set and look at the life cycle of this data and look for opportunities to delete the data, split the data, archive the data, encrypt the data, and so on and so forth. And you'll probably find that there are a lot of opportunities out there to do that.
Okay, and then we have another question from Abhishek. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. These 15 questions, is there any other steps we as a business analyst need to follow in our daily activities to ensure a secure workplace?
That's a very broad question. I think that if you feel like you can become a cybersecurity champion, try to go into every meeting and have a question that you can ask your fellow coworkers to try and nudge them towards thinking themselves about protecting, customers. So, for example, if you went into a meeting where, I don't know, you guys are talking about building a new mobile app or a new website, well, just with a simple question like, how are we going to make sure that our customers are protected from cyber breaches? It's a very simple question to ask, but if you went into every meeting with the intention of every time asking a single question that will help with cybersecurity, you would have become a cybersecurity champion, and over time, people will become more and more conscientious about the topic, and it will yield results. It will be a long-term process, but it will yield results, absolutely for sure.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question from Mamoon. If a large company had no cybersecurity measures, where would you start after educating them?
You know, I think that a really good place to start is to do a technical assessment, something like a penetration test to understand what technical vulnerabilities you may have on your network or on your critical websites. If you have a network that is, you know, more than 250 machines, I'd recommend as well doing what we call a breach assessment. And that's where a security professional is going to look at every machine one by one and make sure that it has not already been compromised. And what you can typically do is that if you have, if you know your vulnerabilities, and then if you find out whether you've been hacked and who the people who hacked you are, that gives you a very good awareness as to where you're standing today and how big the problem is for your company. And then from that point on, we can actually start designing a plan to reduce the risk. And that plan, you know, can be a multi-year program, an ongoing program, for example.
Okay, and then we have another question from Steve. Is there a password manager you recommend?
Yes, there is. There is a password manager called KeePass that is free. It is open source. It is widely used. Many of the people that I respect as vulnerability researchers in the industry have tried to hack it and have not succeeded. So I would recommend this one.
Okay, thank you. And then we have one from Ken. How do we secure our customers' data on cloud-based applications?
Good question. Look at encryption. So first and foremost, there are different types of clouds, of course. Okay, you have infrastructure as a service, and you have platform as a service, and you have software as a service. If you're storing customer data in a software as a service model, where you're handing over your data to another company and they manage it end-to-end and they offer all of the software, at this point, you have no control over how good their cybersecurity is, okay? The best you can try and do is to impose clauses in your contract with them to make them liable for any security breaches. The reality is that a lot of companies will not sign on those clauses, but that doesn't matter. You would actually probably already have the legal advantage to be able to sue them if they got breached. So it'd be better probably for you to store your data within Australia, where it's easier to take legal action and where we have a very solid legal system, than outsource it, you know, in countries where you may not have those advantages. Secondly, if you're using a model of platform as a service or software as a service or infrastructure as a service, then the burden of actually protecting the data is onto you. And so at that point, you would want to follow very strict infrastructure security and software development security procedures, whereby you would encrypt the data. You would make sure that whatever applications you're building are not, do not have any critical vulnerabilities, and so on and so forth.
Okay, and we'll have one last question from Robin. Given that we have governments falling back electoral voting systems to paper-based systems, what chance do small, medium businesses have in fighting hackers? What success rates can we expect by training employees?
You have every chance of protecting your business. There's a sad reality to this, which is that, you know, if you face an attacker that is more sophisticated than you have the resources to defend yourself against, they will hack you. That is the sad reality, and that applies to everybody, no matter who they are, including security companies. But you can also take steps, even as a small business, to train your employees on avoiding, phishing attacks and avoiding ransomware. And when working with customers or building applications for customers, to embed more security in what they do and become cybersecurity champions. And further to that, you can then design processes that will make sure that the way you conduct business reduces your cyber risk. And then further to that point, we then can look at additional technologies that can augment what you already have to further reduce your risk. And as a small business, I'd say that if you were ready to spend maybe an initial 30K and then 10K a year, and I'm talking about a very small business here, like maybe 10 to 50 employees, you could achieve amazing results just with that, just with those kind of numbers. Obviously, cybersecurity, as I've stated, no one can achieve perfect security, but you could definitely demonstrate to the marketplace that you've taken reasonable steps to protect your customers, protect yourself, and protect your employees.
Okay, so there was another question that has come through, so we'll make that the last question, and then if you do have any more questions, please get in touch with us and we'll answer them after the session. So the last one's from Gary. Is there a way to identify a reputable company to perform a cybersecurity assessment? For example, member of governing body or association?
Sure. So, obviously I could pitch myself here, but I won't. What I'm going to say is that the cybersecurity industry is an unregulated industry, meaning that many vendors can claim to have, advanced defense skills when really they don't. That's kind of the sad reality to it. What I would recommend is for you to meet with those companies and to understand their assessment capabilities. And very quickly, if you ask them to come in and give you a presentation and you interview 3 to 5 firms, you will see by yourself the difference in the caliber of the people that will make the assessment. You have people that may charge a fortune, but all they do is, send you a very junior person that's just going to run a scan with an automated tool. And then you have more niche players that will cost less money, but they'll give you someone who's really passionate about what they do. They've written their own security testing tools. They've spoken at conferences. They've been part of industry associations, and they've even talked and released products for free on the internet. It's fairly easy to identify which people are the actual good people and which one are not. And my recommendation would be to select a firm not based on the brand of that firm, but based on the person that will do the assessment. Just like maybe when you work with a lawyer, you may select particular people within a big law firm that you would want to work with. I would advise for the same thing when it comes to security assessments.
Perfect. Thank you, Benjamin. I believe all the questions have now been answered. As you leave the session, there will be a short survey on today's webinar. If you could complete the survey, that would be appreciated, as your insights will help us to shape future events. We will also send you a link to the recording of this webinar within the next couple of weeks. If you wanted more information on our security courses, please visit our website at www.gdls.com.au.